Hello there everybody. So today I'm going to be talking about the topic of to what extent can an epidemic be mathematically modelled. And the reason I want to talk about this is that coronavirus has had very peculiar growth, and I want to see how well an epidemic can be modelled. And as there are lots of mathematicians out there who try to model epidemics, and let's see how accurate these models are. So I think this could be a really interesting topic to talk about. So to start off with, I'm going to be talking about epidemiology. So epidemiology is a branch of medicine that looks at the spread of diseases, their distribution, and how to control them. Now there's lots of maths within epidemiology, such as calculating differential equations, and using different models to predict the outcome of an epidemic, and calculating the probability of recovery for a patient. So these are all interesting things that we need to take into account when we're looking at epidemics. There are also statistical analyses and other methods that you can look at to help model this growth. When I say model, I mean like plotting a graph sort of that shows how the number of infected people changes with respect to time. So for example, a graph showing plotting the number of people infected against time since the birth of the outbreak of the disease. So the main model we're going to be looking at is the SIR model. This is the foundation of epidemiology, and let's talk about the SIR model then. So the SIR model, or SIR model, stands for the susceptible, infected, and recovered. The susceptible is modelled as S of t, where t represents time passed since the outbreak. There's also I of t and R of t. So what susceptible means, pretty much, is that how the susceptible people is people who haven't yet got the virus. These are ordinary people who haven't been infected yet. And at the beginning of the outbreak, this is the entire population. And for this model, we're going to let the entire population equal to n. So the susceptible is anyone who can get the disease, which is everyone, apart from people who are immune, but the SIR model doesn't take this into account. Then the infected is the people who have been infected by the disease. This is self-explanatory, I don't need to really talk about this. So you go from being susceptible to being infected, and then go from infected to being recovered. So recovered, this is people who have had the disease, and they've either recovered, they've been cured, or they've passed away. So if you add the susceptible to the infected and the recovered, you should get the total population. And you can do some basic small mathematical sums. For example, if you divide the total number of the susceptible divided by the population, you can see what fraction of the population is susceptible. Same for infected. Divide the infected by the total population, you can see what fraction of the population is infected. Okay. So if we can break down the SIR model into three differential equations. A differential equation is pretty much an equation that models something, that tells it to you with respect to something with respect to something. So for this, we're going to be looking at the rate of change of the susceptible with respect to time. So the first equation is ds by dt equals minus beta si. Beta is the rate of change. Beta is the probability of becoming infected. This needs to be times by the number of susceptible and the number infected, because you're imagining that all the susceptible and infected people are interacting with one another, and then the probability, if you times that by the probability, that tells you how many people are infected on a given day. So it's going back to that, it's the total number of people infected times the total number of people who can be infected times the probability, and that will tell you the rate of change of the number of susceptible. And the reason this is a negative number is because you're always losing out on susceptible people. The susceptible number doesn't increase, it can only decrease, so it's a negative rate of change. The second equation we'll be looking at is di by dt equals beta si minus gamma I. Beta si is the same as before, as we are gaining the number lost from the susceptible category. The people lost from the susceptible category go into the infected, so there's an increase, so there's a positive rate of change. But then we're also minusing gamma I. I is the number of infected, so you times the number infected by the chance of recovery, which is gamma. So the chance of recovery times the number infected tells you how many people will recover each day. So the rate of change of infected is the people becoming infected minus people becoming recovered, pretty much. And then let's move on to the third equation, which is dr by dt equals gamma I, where gamma I is the same as it was in the previous equation. So this is, in the previous equation we had minus gamma I, as people are going from the infected category to recovered, so they're recovering from the virus. So for the recovered category, this is again a number. So gamma times I is the number of people recovered from the infected category each day. So yeah, that's quite interesting. So we can break down these equations even further to try and calculate how severe the virus is, because if di by dt is less than 0, then we know that the epidemic will not be a threat. It will quickly dissipate, and it doesn't really matter, as we can see that more people are recovering than getting the illness, hence there is a negative rate of change of the number infected. If the value is greater than 0, so di by dt is greater than 0, then we know that the epidemic is growing, and it's growing over time. So this would cause the epidemic to grow rapidly, so this is not a good thing. So for the equation, we're going to be using di by dt equals beta si minus gamma I, which is the same as before. And we're going to be working at t equals 0, because what epidemiologists do, they look at the rate of change in the number infected when at the beginning of an infection, so when there is no time, when time equals 0, and they're seeing if the epidemic will grow and becoming something big like the coronavirus, or if it will just quickly disappear and there'll be no low transmission rate. So we're going to be swapping out the S for S0, which represents the initial susceptible, and I into I0, and we're testing whether di by dt is less than 0. So if you write out beta S0 I0 minus gamma I0 is less than 0, then we know that I0 must be 1, because there's at the beginning initial people infected will always be 1. You cannot have 0 infected, otherwise there will be no virus, and it usually stems from 1 or 2 people. So we're going to say I0 equals 1, so we can cancel out the I0s, so we get beta S0 minus gamma is less than 0, and then if we add gamma to both sides, we get beta S0 is less than gamma, and then divide both sides by gamma. We have beta S0 over gamma less than 1. So this epidemiologist, they use this equation and they rearrange it to equal R0 equals beta S0 over gamma, and R0 is the rate of infection. So if the rate of infection is greater than 0, then we know that the epidemic will be a problem. But if it's less than 0, we know it will not be a problem. So we end up with the total equation of R0 equals beta S0 over gamma. So from here we can see that R0 is directly proportional to S0 and beta. So by decreasing any of these, we'll have a decrease in the infection rate. So since beta is the probability of becoming infected, if we reduce this, it will reduce R0 as they're directly proportional. So we can apply this to modern model problems. So we can see that by social distancing and quarantining, we can decrease beta, and this will decrease R0, which is what we want. We're trying to decrease the infection rate. And then you can also decrease S0, which is the initial susceptible people, by introducing a vaccine. A vaccine will prevent someone from having the epidemic, so the number of susceptible people will be lower. So if you have a vaccine, you inject it into someone, someone goes straight from the S category to the R category, so they can no longer get the virus, which is what we want. And then as it's directly proportional to R0, decreasing S0 will decrease R0, which is good. Okay. So the SIR model can also be split up into the SEIR model. So the I category, the I portion of the SIR, becomes E and I, where E equals the exposed people and I is the infectious. E pretty much means exposed, so people who have the virus transmitted to them, but they don't exhibit any symptoms, and they cannot pass it on to anyone else. So we know that for coronavirus, the median time period of having the disease and not showing symptoms is 5.1 days. So if someone infectious comes up to you, you get the virus, it'll be 5 days before you show symptoms. So for 5 days you'll be in the exposed category. So the infectious category is people who are infected and are showing symptoms. So this is anyone after those first 5 days. So the SEIR model assumes that an exposed individual cannot infect a susceptible one, which is what we've said before. And then it plots this new graph, and on the new graph we can see that the infected curve is on the SEIR model is lower than it was on the SIR model. This is because a large proportion of the infected category is taken up by the exposed. The infectious curve peaks at a later point because there's lag between getting exposed and becoming infectious, which we know is 5 days. And if you add S, E, I and R, you should get the total population, which is equal to N. And then now we can create new equations from this. So ds by dt equals minus beta Si. Before it was the rate of change of susceptible to infected. Now it's the rate of change of susceptible going into the exposed category. So it's the same equation, minus beta Si, where beta is the probability and the chance of becoming infected. Then the next equation is de by dt, de over dt equals beta Si minus sigma E, where sigma is the probability of, sigma is the probability of becoming infectious, I believe. No. Sigma E is the proportion of the population that goes from exposed to infectious each day. So beta Si, people becoming exposed, minus sigma E, which is people becoming infectious. So it's very similar to the di by dt equation in the previous SIR model. And this is where it gets a bit confusing. Now we have di by dt. You have to remember that I is infectious, not infected. The difference between these two is that infected represents anyone who has the disease, but infectious just means someone who has the disease and can spread it. So infected is exposed and infectious. Infectious is just the infectious part. Hopefully you can understand that. So di by dt, the rate of change of the infectious, is sigma E minus gamma I. So sigma E is the proportion of people coming in from the exposed category into the infectious category each day, and then gamma I is the probability of someone becoming recovered each day, and how many people becoming recovered each day is being minused from the people becoming infected each day, infectious each day. So if gamma I is greater than sigma E, then the rate of change of infectious is decreasing, which is what we want. And then we can get one last equation, which is dr by dt equals gamma I. This is the same as the previous. This is the same as the SEIR model. So dr by dt, the rate of change of the recovered, is the proportion of people becoming recovered from the infectious category. So yeah, okay. The next model we'll be looking at is the SIS model. This stands for susceptible, infected, susceptible. So for example, viruses like the winter flu work differently to the SEIR model. So the SEIR model assumes that if you get the virus, you become infected and then you become recovered. But the SIS model says that you become recovered, but instead of becoming recovered, you're susceptible once again. So you catch the disease, and then you're recovered, but then you can catch the disease the second time, and it goes on again and again and again. There's infinite times you can catch it. So this is the same as the winter flu. So, for example, you get the cold 1 year, and then you recover. You can still catch it another year. The way biology explains viruses is that you have antibodies and antigens and loads of white blood cells there's memory cells, and if you catch a disease, the memory cells, they know what to do next time you get it, so they stop you from catching it a second time. But with cases like the winter flu, the virus is evolving to an extent that you cannot prevent yourself from getting it more than once. So if we look at this graph, we can see that the susceptible population starts at the maximum and infectious starts at the minimum. However, this time not everyone gets the disease, as there is constantly changing numbers from people going from ill to being healthy, and these counteract each other, so there's no point where everyone's susceptible or everyone's infected. Then we can create two equations from this, where ds by dt equals minus beta si plus gamma I. So we also have di by dt equals beta si minus gamma I. So this might seem confusing, but if we just split it up if we just look at the di by dt equation, as that's the most simple one, we can see it's the rate of change of the people being infected, and this is the gain in people becoming infected minus the loss of people becoming recovered. But then because it's the SIS model, you can go from being infected to being susceptible. So recovering means you become susceptible. So if we look at ds by dt, it's plus gamma I as you're gaining the recovered, minus beta si, people going from susceptible back to infected. So this is quite confusing. It's like a constant cycle, but you can understand it quite easily, I think. Okay, next we're going to be looking at the SIR model with vital dynamics. So vital dynamics is when you consider natural births and deaths within a population. When somebody is born, they are susceptible, but this person can also die from natural causes, which are unrelated to the epidemic. So we're going to be adapting our previous equations with the birth rate, which will be mu, and the death rate, which is v. So then we now have three sets of differential equations. ds by dt equals minus beta si plus mu n minus vs. So the first part of the equation is the same. We have the people going from susceptible to infected, but we also have mu n and minus vs. Mu n is the possibility of someone within the population giving birth, and then minus vs represents the probability of one of the people dying. So if you die, that pretty much means you go straight to the recovered category. The second equation is di by dt equals beta si minus gamma I minus vi. The first bit's the same, beta si minus gamma I, which is the rate of change of the infected, so people becoming infected from the susceptible, minus people becoming recovered. And then this is minused by vi, and vi represents the fact that somebody can die while infected, but not due to the epidemic, so for example, maybe a car crash or something. And then we can finally look at the last equation, where we have dr by dt equals gamma I minus vi. And throughout this, we just have to imagine that if you die from natural causes, this means you're technically recovered because you cannot get the disease again. So dr by dt equals gamma I minus vi. Gamma I is the proportion of people becoming infected from the susceptible category, and then vi is the number of people dying from natural causes who are infected. Okay. Now we'll be looking at the limitations of the SIR model. So the SIR model assumes that anyone who gets the pandemic is the same. It does not consider the immunity for everybody. For example, the coronavirus affects mainly older people, and so the probability of a child getting the epidemic is lower than that of a senior citizen. The SIR model also assumes that the population is continuously mixing in with one another, so the susceptible always meeting infected. There's no sense of fear or anything, and there's no social distancing or quarantine, so you don't have this susceptible separated from the infected. The SIR model assumes that everyone just mixes around. The model also assumes that everybody is susceptible at one point. However, there are people who are immune to start off with, so the number of recovered will not be zero when the epidemic starts, but the SIR model assumes that people are all susceptible, but there are people who are immune. Now we're going to look at the accuracy of the SIR model. We're going to look at the case count for coronavirus in the UK up to April the 27th, as this closely mirrors the first proportion of the SIR model. So the total case count is pretty much the same as the number of infected people. So the rate of change, di by dt, is the number of new people coming in, getting infected, minus the number of people becoming recovered. And we can see that there's exponential growth to start off with. However, it quickly slows down, and then it linearizes, and then there's a peak. But because we're looking at April 27th, there has not been a peak yet. But if we look at now, which is the date, we're near the end of June, so we can see that there has peaked and the graph has plateaued, and not plateaued, it's gone back down to, the case count's gone much lower. And we can see that this is similar to the SEIR model, as the number of infected people peaks and then decreases. And then eventually it goes back to zero. And then, as I said at the beginning, we're going to be looking at other epidemics. I found a graph of the number of Ebola cases in Liberia across 2014 to 2015. And then we could see that the graph is almost perfectly mirroring the I part of the SIR model. There is quick exponential growth at the beginning, which slows down, and there is a peak, and then it decreases, and then it becomes zero at the end. So we can see that the SIR model is actually done quite a good job of predicting, of representing epidemics. But obviously there will be times when there are large differences. So to conclude, I will say that the SIR model is not 100% accurate when predicting the growth of an epidemic. This is because there are limitations to the model, and we can keep adding more and more variables to the model, such as vital dynamics, other things. We can SEIR, SIS. Then there's also the SI category, where once you become infected, it's permanent. This would be used to describe HIV, where once you're infected, there is no recovering, so it's permanent infection. But each time we add to the model, it makes it more and more accurate to real life. So, but then we can also keep on adding. So if we add to the SEIR, we can add to the fact that what if an exposed could infect? We assumed earlier on that exposed cannot infect, but what if you have no symptoms and can infect? This would represent a lot of coronavirus in people who have coronavirus, as a lot of them don't show symptoms, so they would come under the exposed category, but they can infect other people. So the SEIR model doesn't account for this, but we can adapt the model, and now we can add in the rate of change to susceptible would be minus beta SI minus DSE, where DSE is a probability of being infected by an exposed person. And this just gets even more complex once you introduce social distancing, quarantine, or even a vaccine. So overall, I will say that the basic SIR model is a relatively accurate way to predict the spread of an epidemic. It can be used to explain any sudden influxes in growth of the number of infected. It can be used to predict the end of an epidemic roughly, but the SIR model just gives rough explanations. The model cannot be extrapolated and is not perfect when giving you an exact date. So you cannot, from the first month or so of coronavirus, you can't use the SIR model to say exactly what day it's going to end. You can maybe guess like within a month or so, but you're not going to get an exact date, because models cannot become a mathematical model will never be perfect in that way. So an epidemic can be mathematically modelled relatively accurately, but it will never be 100% perfect. So thank you for watching this, and I hope you have a great day. Bye.